finish up with some other monetary matters. There are some things we have not got to yet, but you kind of got to know to understand the global economy, but also the economy of your state, which affects your job and your standard of life. And let's just cut to the chase. The one you're hearing a lot about in today's news is the economic growth rate. What's our economic growth rate? Our economic growth rate's really bad right now. We must be in a recession. Oh, what are we going to do? I've lost all my 401k in the recession. Okay, well, what's the economic growth rate? It's actually pretty easy because we've already talked about this stuff. We talked about GDP. The economic growth rate for any state is how much bigger the GDP has gotten every year or every quarter. You can do it by any time you want, but we usually do it on a yearly basis. And that is simply, you had this much money this year in your economy, your GDP was this, and it's gotten this much bigger. You've grown by a certain percent by next year. That's the economic growth rate. Quick example, because I ain't good at math, I gotta keep it easy. Let's say your GDP is worth $100. Let's pretend we're Somalia. So our GDP is worth $100. And if we had a GDP growth rate, an economic growth rate of 1%, then this time next year, we would expect to be 1% bigger than $100, $101. If our economic growth rate was 10%, then if we had $100 this year, it would be $110 next year. You get it? So whatever that percentage is, you multiply the GDP by and then tack it back on. That's how much bigger the GDP is getting every year. Now, put it in perspective. The year 2010, the United States has a 2.5% economic growth rate, okay? And the U.S. economy is ginormous, right? It's like $14 trillion. So you take $14 trillion, multiply it by 2.5, whatever you get, add it back into 14 trillion. That's how much the economy should be worth in 2011. Yeah? Now, 2.5 is actually kind of low for the United States. They're usually in the 3 to 5% range, but we'll come back to that because there's other countries that don't even got that, like France. They're only at the 1.5%. That's not really that good. Their economy is only going to get 1.5% bigger this time next year. Italy's even worse. Go flip some pizzas, fellas. Pick it up. Make some wine. They only have a 1% economic growth rate. Go to some other countries which are hustling a little faster right now economically, like Brazil with 4.5% economic growth rate, Russia 5%, Kazakhstan 6.5%, and China, 9.5% is their economic growth rate, almost to double digits, and they've hit 10 to 14% economic growth rate in the last decade, multiple times. They're on fire, the Chinese dragon. That is some serious growth. 10% bigger every year? Yeah, big time. Now, this GDP / economic growth is important for understanding other recognizable terms in the news a lot here lately, which are based on these numbers and figures and stuff. Things like recession and depression. Now, these terms actually have no concrete exact meaning based on precise mathematical equations or anything, but they're roughly and generally understood to be something like this, and you should know this stuff too. A recession is when your state's GDP falls for 2 consecutive quarters, 2 quarters of a year. So if you were worth this much money and you got smaller this quarter and a little smaller the next one after that, you would say that we are in a recession now. We're receding, we're getting smaller. Of course, the GDP is just a measure of production and consumption. So it could be, well, maybe that's not really true. Maybe we're really not shrinking. But whenever the GDP drops, economic growth rate drops, there is associated drop in employment. It means less jobs, less wages, less consumer spending, less investment, less income take home. Everybody starts to get worried. People start spending less. And because of that, people might lose their jobs because businesses can't keep selling enough stuff. And industries then won't expand. And they're going to lay off more people. And so people get more worried and they spend less. And you see how this is like a vicious cycle. That's what happens in recessions. You're living through one right now. Now, if it gets a little worse than that, you're on full-on depression. And a depression is so sad. A depression. No, not economically. A depression is when your state's GDP declines more than 10% of its value. Booyah! Or it's a recession lasting 2 years or more. So continued slow decline over 2 years or more, or a 10% drop in your total. That is full-on depression. Remember the Great Depression of the 1930s? Of course you don't remember it, you weren't alive. But even if your GDP is not actually shrinking, even if it's not shrinking, if it's still getting a little bit bigger every year, people don't like it if it's not growing fast enough. They get all worried. If our economic growth rates are not that high, though, this really sucks. And they'll refer to it as economic stagnation. And economic stagnation is a prolonged period of very slow GDP growth. Again, it could be still growing, but very slow. Not fast enough for people who want to see stuff happen, all right? So if you're only growing by like 2 to 3% a year for years and years and years, that would be a state of semi-stagnation, if not full stagnation. Hey, in the United States, it's getting pretty close to that right now. We'll come back to that, though. Okay, if we're not growing fast enough, then who is? Who is growing economically right now? Who is exploding economically right now? Who's shrinking economically? Who's stagnant? And what does the future hold? See, I'm all about you understanding today. I'm much more into you understanding and predicting tomorrow and the future of the rest of your life. And I'll tell you right from the get-go, watch out! The Asian tide is coming in like a tsunami, getting ready to sweep over us economically. Okay, that sounds extreme. What do I mean by that? Well, just look at a snapshot of world economic growth rates in 2010 to see what I mean. As always, check out the pattern, geographic style. The colors tell all. Those dark greens mean less than 0, like nothing, Somalia. The light green is less than 3% economic growth rate, and that's not very much. That's a state of semi-stagnation. But look what happens with those oranges. The darker the orange color, the hotter the economy is. It's growing faster and faster with those very dark colors, over 10% economic growth rate for 2010. Some quick trends of note. The United States, of course, is at 2.5% economic growth rate. But look at all of Europe and Japan. Most of the rich countries in the world in 2010 are at a less than 3% economic growth rate. Man, that's not so hot. They're the ones that have been getting hurt the worst by this economic recession. But the rest of the world is in not such a bad slump. Look at Latin America. Brazil's at 4.5% economic growth rate. And almost all the countries of Latin America are in the 3 to 6% range, doing not bad. Bump over to Russia at 5%. Kazakhstan at 6.5%. Virtually all of Central Asia is over 6% economic growth rate. And some of the highest growth rates in the world, Vietnam and parts of Southeast Asia at 7%. Indonesia in that same ballpark. India at 8%. China at 9.5%. Kablamo! And it's even higher in some very odd places too. Iraq has a 7% economic growth rate. The Democratic Republic of Congo, 7.5%. Turkmenistan, 9%. Mongolia, 12% economic growth rate. What the hell are the Mongols up to? Is Genghis Khan back in town, rallying them to take over Asia by economic force? I don't think so. And more importantly, those poor green countries. Wait a minute, they're not the poor countries. Those are the richest countries in the world. Why are they such low growth rates? How come the United States is so economically growth low, and Iraq and Mongolia and even a bunch of poor-ass African nations are thumping the U.S.? Yeah, look at Africa. It's mostly lit up in the 3 to 6 and 6 to 10% range as well. How can that be? Isn't the United States the richest country on the planet with the biggest GDP? How can we be so economically stagnant? Well, there's actually a bunch of reasons why all of these things appear on this economic growth rate map. 5 reasons of note. I'm sure there's more. Here are the 5 I'm coming up with. Why other countries have rising and higher economic growth rates than the richest countries in the world right now. 1. When you start with a much smaller base, the much smaller GDP, it's way easier to grow way more and way faster. It's simple mathematics. If you're Somalia and your GDP is $100, well, guess what? If somebody drops a $5 bill on the ground in your country, you just have a GDP growth rate of 5%. So if you have a very small number, very poor, smaller countries, it doesn't take a lot of economic activity to bump up their percentage very quickly. And the inverse holds true on that as well. Look at the United States, a $14 trillion GDP. My God, how much money do you have to add to that economy just to add another percent every year? Again, I'm sure it's an easy mathematical problem, but you guys figured out I can't do it. 2.5% economic growth rate on 14 trillion is a hell of a lot. So you have to add a lot more to the giant economies to get those bigger growth percentages. And the biggest economies on the planet simply just don't grow that fast, China being a semi-exception. 2, the insatiable demand for fossil fuel energy, coal, oil, natural gas, has made energy-rich countries really, really, really rich and growing, because that energy need just keeps going up every year. As India gets rich, as China gets rich, they need more energy too. The price of energy will continue to go up your entire lives. Therefore, anyone who has energy is going to be making money your entire life, their entire life. So energy rich, but even natural resource rich countries, as the world has 7 billion people in it, 7 billion people who need a lot more stuff all the time, even countries that are rich in copper or magnesium or cobalt, those prices keep going up. Countries rich in something continue to get rich and probably will continue to get rich. Their economies continue to grow based mostly on those single resources. 3, peace equals economic boom. What? Yeah. Anytime you have a country, state, that was at war and now the war's over, economic boom times. Stuff goes through the roof. And that's why Iraq is at 7% growth rate right now, why the DRC there in Africa is probably bumping up too. Because peace brings stability, and when things get stable, I mean, it could be a bad end to a war. It doesn't matter if it's a good or bad ending to the war, but as soon as the war ends, everybody starts rebuilding. Construction booms, industries start moving back in, people start going back to work, everybody starts buying more stuff and spending more money. Economies boom after times of war. Watch for Iraq to continue to grow in their economic growth rate, and watch Afghanistan go through the roof as soon as NATO troops leave. You heard it here first. 4, a population boom sometimes equals an economic boom. And that is if you have a very vibrant and growing and swelling population. We usually refer to those growing populations in developing countries. But if you have a booming population base, that's more people, that's more workers. More workers equals cheaper labor. Cheaper labor equals more industries from abroad come in to take advantage of your cheaper labor, meaning there's more jobs, and more jobs mean more money, and people start getting paid more, and they start consuming more, and there's usually a growing middle class, even if it's a lower middle class, and there's more consumption and more buying and more selling, more everything. Sometimes. If you're in an impoverished area, a population boom just means that there's more people to starve, but it can happen the other way as well. And this last one's perhaps a little bit more nebulous, but 5 of reasons why other countries' growth rates are higher than the U.S. is that sometimes a state's economy is just hustling. It's just on fire. It's just at the right place at the right time, making the right goods that the rest of the world just can't live without. And it's moving up the economic sector chain. And remember that stuff, the economic evolution? In times where a state is transitioning from one sector to the other, it really is booming economic times, meaning when you cross the border and concentrate moving all of your 50% of your farmers out of the field into industry and start mechanizing and becoming manufacturing hub, the economy booms. If you then move from an economic manufacturing center to a service sector economy, the economy will boom once again. It's not sustained forever, but that usually means growth is happening. Things are changing. People are investing in buying more and making more and doing more. And that's when economies boom all over the planet. Let's finish up with world trends then. Thinking about the entire globe economically. Asia's on fire! And I'm thinking of East Asia, specifically China in the middle of that, but don't forget South Korea, very big economy, and Southeast Asia down there, Vietnam and Indonesia and Thailand. This area is fast becoming the epicenter of the entire global economy, perhaps superseding the mighty, mighty USA in the coming decades. I'm not trying to hurt anybody's feelings in the US. You had your day in the sun. I mean, Europe was the center of the global economy for centuries. Then it shifted over to America as the center of all the action. And it's just Asia's turn now. China is the center of that, but there are other Asian states that are doing quite well, we've already pointed out. And let's take it one step further in Asia as well. India is coming up very strong too, albeit on a different path than China. They, of course, are pushing hard for those high-end service sector and quaternary jobs, and they have a ways to go, and they're not growing as fast as China and other East Asian states, but they're hitting double-digit growth very soon too. So watch out for a rising India. Latin America is also holding its own, but at a much slower growth spurt than any of these Asian entities we've talked about so far. They have steady gains, which continue to be made across most of Latin America, and they're really following their kind of local economic giant leader, that being Brazil. That's the up-and-coming world titan of Latin America is Brazil. In other parts of the planet, Europe, Eastern and Western, Japan, lots of other of the rich, developed places are really semi-stagnant and sliding. I mean, they're got tough times ahead. Now, take that with a grain of salt. They're rich as hell. They have high standards of living. They're doing okay. It's not like chaos is reigning in these places, but they are not going to be the center of economic action and trade and finance, not for the rest of your life. They're nice places to visit, but that is not where the true action is. Go to Asia for that. And last but not leastly, Africa. I mean, they're poor as hell, but even though they may be the poorest, that kind of means that they have the most to grow. So look for a lot of economic growth out of many African countries, particularly the ones that get their political act together and get rid of the corruption and get rid of the dictators. Those places have a very high likelihood of booming in your lifetime. Overall, big world picture speaking, many of the less developed or developing states on the planet are growing the fastest with the biggest economic growth rates. Most of the richest, fully developed places are kind of growing still, but much, much, much slower and perhaps even shrinking in certain countries. This kind of big picture is equalizing wealth and opportunity around the world. Now, again, I'm not some liberal college professor telling you this is the way it should be. I'm just saying it's the way that it is. You're having different centers of wealth crop up for perhaps the first time in human history, where you got a vibrant US, a vibrant Europe that's rich, a vibrant Japan that's rich, a growing China that's rich, a growing India that's getting rich, all over the place. This is kind of unique and new and kind of cool if you think about it. And there are, of course, several regional economic powerhouses rising to carve out their piece of the global economic pie over the course of your lifetimes. I do want you to be aware of these. Jot these down. Namely, China, of course, India, of course, second, Brazil, we've mentioned. Russia is now resilient and rising economically again. Turkey, yeah, not just for Thanksgiving. Turkey's getting hot. South Africa, Indonesia. These are places that have some heavy economic activity going down and are getting richer, and things are happening. It's kind of fun and cool. Have I forgotten anybody? I mean, are we done? Economically, globally, we're good? What about the U.S.? I forgot to talk about the United States. And perhaps we'll talk about this much more throughout this semester since you're most interested in that place because you live here. Words of encouragement. The U.S. is down, but it is not out. Yes, this global recession is bad, and it was started in the U.S., and the U.S. has tons of credit problems and finance problems and budgetary problems. But it's a very resilient economy. It will be getting back in the game, and when it gets back, it will be getting back in a very big way. It is the biggest economy on planet Earth. It's the center of innovation and technology and lots of other things. That's not going to change overnight. Yes, these other powers are rising, but when the U.S. gets up, dusts itself off, and gets back in the game, it will in a very big way again. But there will be new players on the field whenever the U.S. comes back up to bat. And that's what makes life curious, interesting, and exciting. Cool? All right, let's move on then and wrap this baby up.